When al-Assad inherited power in 2000 after the death of his father, Hafez, there was cautious optimism for political change in Syria. Originally an eye doctor studying in London, al-Assad was never meant to become president. He was called back to Syria after the death of his older brother, Basil. In order for Bashar to assume the presidency, the parliament had to lower the minimum age for candidates from 40 to 34. He won a referendum with more than 97% of the vote, where he was the only candidate. The quiet, reserved man initially generated hopes for reform, but aside from a few limited economic changes, his rule closely resembled his father's 30 years of authoritarian governance. After more than 13 years of war, hundreds of thousands of people killed and millions displaced, the 24-year rule of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is over. Large crowds on Sunday gathered in the streets of Damascus to celebrate, after opposition forces took control of the capital in a stunning advance that saw them seize several key cities in a matter of days. Al-Assad reportedly fled the country on an aeroplane, bringing an end to more than 53 years of his family's authoritarian rule over Syria. His departure leaves a country in ruins and millions of Syrians wondering what's next. At the onset of the Syrian revolution, corruption in Syria was endemic, and the country was ranked 129th in the 2011 Corruption Perceptions Index. Since the 1970s, Syria's economy has been dominated by the patronage networks of Baath party elites and Alawite loyalists of the Assad family, who established control over Syria's public sectors based on kinship and nepotism. The pervasive nature of corruption had been a source of controversy within the Baath party circles and the wider public, as early as the 1980s. Bashar al-Assad's economic liberalization program during the 2000s became a symbol of corruption and nepotism, as the beneficiaries of the scheme were Alawite loyalists who seized much of the privatized sectors and business assets. This alienated the government from the vast majority of the Syrian public, particularly rural Syrians and urban working classes, who widely loathed the ensuing economic disparities, which became overtly visible. Assad's cousin Rami Makhlouf was the regime's most favored oligarch during this period, marked by the institutionalization of corruption, handicapping of small businesses and casting down private entrepreneurship. The persistence of corruption, sectarian bias towards al-Whites, nepotism and widespread bribery that existed in party, bureaucracy and military led to popular anger that resulted in the eruption of the 2011 Syrian revolution. The protests were the most fierce in working-class neighborhoods, which had long bore the brunt of the regime's exploitation policies that privileged its own loyalists. According to ABC News, as a result of the Syrian civil war, government-controlled Syria is truncated in size, battered and impoverished. Economic sanctions, the Syria Accountability Act, were applied long before the Syrian civil war by the US and were joined by the EU at the outbreak of the civil war, causing disintegration of the Syrian economy. These sanctions were reinforced in October 2014 by the EU and US. Industry in parts of the country that are still held by the government is heavily state-controlled, with economic liberalization being reversed during the current conflict. The London School of Economics has stated that as a result of the Syrian civil war, a war economy has developed in Syria. A 2014 European Council on Foreign Relations report also stated that a war economy has formed. 3 years into a conflict that is estimated to have killed at least 140,000 people from both sides, much of the Syrian economy lies in ruins. As the violence has expanded and sanctions have been imposed, assets and infrastructure have been destroyed, economic output has fallen, and investors have fled the country. Unemployment now exceeds 50% and half of the population lives below the poverty line. Against this backdrop, a war economy is emerging that is creating significant new economic networks and business activities that feed off the violence, chaos, and lawlessness gripping the country. This war economy, to which Western sanctions have inadvertently contributed, is creating incentives for some Syrians to prolong the conflict and making it harder to end it. A UN-commissioned report by the Syrian Center for Policy Research states that 2/3 of the Syrian population now lives in extreme poverty. Unemployment stands at 50%. In October 2014, a $50 million mall opened in Tartus, which provoked criticism from government supporters and was seen as part of an Assad government policy of attempting to project a sense of normalcy throughout the civil war. A government policy to give preference to families of slain soldiers for government jobs was cancelled after it caused an uproar, while rising accusations of corruption caused protests. In December 2014, the EU banned sales of jet fuel to the Assad government, forcing the government to buy more expensive uninsured jet fuel shipments in the future. Taking advantage of the increased role of the state as a result of the civil war, Bashar and his wife Asma have begun annexing Syria's economic assets from their loyalists, seeking to displace the old business elites and monopolize their direct control of the economy. al-Assad, the brother of Bashar, has also become wealthy by overseeing the operations of Syria's state-sponsored Captagon drug industry and seizing much of the spoils of war. The ruling couple currently owns vast swathes of Syria's shipping, real estate, telecommunications, and banking sectors. Significant changes have been happening to Syrian economy since the government's confiscation campaigns launched in 2019, which involved major economic assets being transferred to the presidential couple to project their power and influence. Particularly noteworthy dynamic has been the rise of Asma al-Assad, who heads Syria's clandestine economic council and is thought to have become a central funnel of economic power in Syria. Through her Syria Trust NGO, the backbone of her financial network, Asma vets the foreign aid coming to Syria, since the government authorizes UN organizations only if it works under state agencies. Corruption has been rising sporadically in recent years, with Syria being considered the most corrupt country in the Arab world. As of 2022, Syria is the ranked second worst globally in the Corruption Perceptions Index. Hafez al-Assad's government was widely counted amongst the most repressive Arab dictatorships of the 20th century. As Bashar inherited his father's mantle, he sought to implement authoritarian upgrading by purging the old guard and staffing party and military with loyalist Alawite officers, further entrenching the sectarianism within the system. While officially the Ba'athist government adheres to a strict secularist doctrine, in practice it has implemented sectarian engineering policies in the society to suppress dissent and monopolize its absolute power. During Hafez al-Assad's reign, he resorted to emphasizing the sectarian identities that the previous Ba'ath party rejected, believing the only way to ensure stability was through building a trusted security force. Hafez pursued a strategy to make the Alawite community a loyal monolith while keeping Syria's Sunni majority divided. Yet Syria became a police state, enforcing stability through threat of brute force repression. Bashar had already followed in his father's footsteps, carefully maneuvering his most loyal allies into the military security apparatus, government ministries, and the Ba'ath party. Antonia Robson. The regime has attempted to portray itself to the outside world as the protector of minorities and instills the fear of the majority rule in the society to mobilize loyalists from minorities. Assad loyalist figures like Michel Samaha have advocated sectarian mobilization to defend the regime from what he labeled as the Sea of Sunnis. Assad regime has unleashed sectarian violence through private Alawite militias like the Shabiha, particularly in Sunni areas. Alawite religious iconography and communal sentiments are common themes used by Alawite warrior sheikhs who lead the Alawite militias, as justification to commit massacres, abductions, and torture in opposition strongholds. Various development policies adopted by the regime had followed a sectarian pattern. An urbanization scheme implemented by the government in the city of Homs led to expulsions of thousands of Sunni residents during the 2000s, while Alawite majority areas were left intact. Even as Syrian Ba'athism absorbed diverse communal identities into the homogeneous unifying discourse of the state, socio-political power became monopolized by Alawite loyalists. Despite officially adhering to non-confessionalism, Syrian armed forces have also been institutionally sectarianized. While the conscripts and lower ranks are overwhelmingly non-Alawite, the higher ranks are packed by Alawite loyalists who effectively control the logistics and security policy. Elite units of the Syrian military such as the Tiger Forces, Republican Guard, 4th Armored Division, etc. regarded by the government as crucial for its survival, are composed mostly of al-Whites. Sunni officers are under constant surveillance by the secret police, with most of them being assigned with Alawite assistants who monitor their movements. Pro-regime paramilitary groups such as the National Defense Force are also organized around sectarian loyalty to the Ba'athist government. During the Syrian revolution uprisings, the Ba'athist government deployed a securitization strategy that depended on sectarian mobilization, unleashing violence on protesters and extensive crackdowns across the country, prompting opposition groups to turn to armed revolt. Syrian society was further sectarianized following the Iranian intervention in the Syrian civil war, which witnessed numerous Khomeinist militant groups sponsored by Iran fight in the side of the Assad government. Human rights. Ba'athist government has been ruling Syria as a totalitarian state, policing every aspect of Syrian society for decades. Commanders of government's security forces, consisting of Syrian Arab Army, secret police, Ba'athist paramilitaries, directly implement the executive functions of the state, with scant regard for legal processes and bureaucracy. The surveillance system of the Mukhabarat is pervasive, with the total number of agents working for its various branches estimated to be as high as 1:158 ratio with the civilian population. Security services shut down civil society organizations, curtail freedom of movement within the country and bans non-Ba'athist political literature and symbols. In 2010, Human Rights Watch published the report A Wasted Decade documenting repression during Assad's first decade of emergency rule, marked by arbitrary arrests, censorship and discrimination against Syrian Kurds. Throughout the 2000s, the dreaded Mukhabarat agents carried out routine abductions, arbitrary detentions, and torture of civilians. Numerous show trials were conducted against dissidents, filling Syrian prisons with journalists and human rights activists. Members of Syria's General Intelligence Directorate had long enjoyed broad privileges to carry out extrajudicial actions and they have immunity from criminal offenses. In 2008, Assad extended this immunity to other departments of security forces. Human rights groups, such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have detailed how the Assad government's secret police tortured, imprisoned, and killed political opponents, and those who speak out against the government. In addition, some 600 Lebanese political prisoners are thought to be held in government prisons since the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, with some held for as long as over 30 years. Since 2006, the Assad government has expanded the use of travel bans against political dissidents. In an interview with ABC News in 2007, Assad stated, "We don't have such things as political prisoners," though the New York Times reported the arrest of 30 Syrian political dissidents who were organizing a joint opposition front in December 2007, with 3 members of this group considered to be opposition leaders being remanded in custody. The government also denied permission for human rights organizations and independent NGOs to work in the country. In 2010, Syria banned face veils at universities. Following the protests of Syrian revolution in 2011, Assad partially relaxed the veil ban. Foreign Affairs Journal released an editorial on the Syrian situation in the wake of the 2011 protests. During its decades of rule, the Assad family developed a strong political safety net by firmly integrating the military into the government. In 1970, Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, seized power after rising through the ranks of the Syrian armed forces, during which time he established a network of loyal al-Whites by installing them in key posts. In fact, the military, ruling elite, and ruthless secret police are so intertwined that it is now impossible to separate the Assad regime from the security establishment. Bashar al-Assad's threat to use force against protesters would be more plausible than Tunisia's or Egypt's were. So, unlike in Tunisia and Egypt, where a professionally trained military tended to play an independent role, the regime and its loyal forces have been able to deter all but the most resolute and fearless oppositional activists. At the same time, it is significantly different from Libya, where the military, although brutal and loyal to the regime, is a more disorganized group of militant thugs than a trained and disciplined army. Between 2011 and 2013, the state security apparatus is believed to have tortured and killed over 10,000 civil activists, political dissidents, journalists, civil defense volunteers and those accused of treason and terror charges, as part of a campaign of deadly crackdown ordered by Assad. In June 2023, UN General Assembly voted in favor of establishing an independent body to investigate the whereabouts of hundreds of thousands of missing civilians who have been forcibly disappeared, killed, or languishing in Assad regime's dungeons and torture chambers. The vote was condemned by Russia, North Korea, and Iran. In 2023, Canada and Netherlands filed a lawsuit against Syria at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, charging the latter with violating the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The joint petition accused the Syrian regime of organizing unimaginable physical and mental pain and suffering as a strategy to collectively punish the Syrian population. Russia vetoed UN Security Council efforts to prosecute Bashar al-Assad at the International Criminal Court. Repression of Kurds. Ba'athist Syria had long banned Kurdish language in schools and public institutions, and discrimination against Kurds steadily increased during the rule of Bashar al-Assad. State policy officially suppressed Kurdish culture, with more than 300,000 Syrian Kurds being rendered stateless. Kurdish grievances against state persecution eventually culminated in the 2004 Qamishli uprisings, which were crushed down violently after sending Syrian military forces. The ensuing crackdown resulted in the killings of more than 36 Kurds and injuring at least 160 demonstrators. More than 2,000 civilians were arrested and tortured in government detention centers. Restrictions on Kurdish activities has been further tightened following the Qamishli massacre, with the Assad regime virtually banning all Kurdish cultural gatherings and political activism under the charges of inciting strife or weakening national sentiment. During 2005 to 2010, Human Rights Watch verified security crackdowns on at least 14 Kurdish political and cultural gatherings. In March 2008, Syrian military opened fire at a Kurdish gathering in Qamishli that marked Nowruz, killing 3 and injuring 5 civilians. Censorship. On September 22, 2001, Assad decreed a press law that tightened government control over all literature printed or published in Syria, ranging from newspapers to books, pamphlets and periodicals. Publishers, writers, editors, distributors, journalists, and other individuals accused of violating the press law are imprisoned or fined. Censorship has also been expanded into the cyberspace, and various websites are banned. Numerous bloggers and content creators have been arrested under various national security charges. A 2007 law requires internet cafes to record all the comments users post on chat forums. Another decree in 2008 obligated internet cafes to keep records of their customers and report them routinely to the police. Websites such as Arabic Wikipedia, YouTube, and Facebook were blocked intermittently between 2008 and February 2011. Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, ranked Syria as the third dangerous country to be an online blogger in 2009. Individuals are arrested based on a wide variety of accusations, ranging from undermining national unity to posting or sharing false content. Syria was ranked as the third most censored country in CPJ's 2012 report. Apart from restrictions for international journalists that prohibit their entry, domestic press is controlled by state agencies that promote Ba'athist ideology. From 2011, the Syrian government has issued a complete media blackout and foreign correspondents were quickly detained, abducted, or tortured. As a result, the outside world is able to know of situations happening inside Syria only through videos of independent civilian journalists. The Assad government has shut down internet coverage, mobile networks as well as telephone lines in areas under its control to prevent any news that has its attempts to monopolize information related to Syria. Crackdowns, ethnic cleansing, and forced disappearances. The crackdown ordered by Bashar al-Assad against Syrian protesters was the most ruthless of all military clampdowns in the entire Arab Spring. As violence deteriorated and death toll mounted to the thousands, the European Union, Arab League, and United States began imposing wide range of sanctions against Assad regime. By December 2011, United Nations had declared the situation in Syria to be a civil war. By this point, all the protesters and armed resistance groups had viewed the unconditional resignation of Bashar al-Assad as part of their core demands. In July 2012, Arab League held an emergency session demanding the swift resignation of Assad and promised safe exit if he accepted the offer. Assad rebuffed the offers, instead seeking foreign military support from Iran and Russia to defend his embattled regime through scorched earth tactics, massacres, sieges, forced starvations, ethnic cleansing, etc. The crackdowns and extermination campaigns of Assad regime resulted in the Syrian refugee crisis, causing the forced displacement of 14 million Syrians, with around 7.2 million refugees. This has made the Syrian refugee crisis the largest refugee crisis in the world, and UNRWA High Commissioner Filippo Grandi has described it as the biggest humanitarian and refugee crisis of our time and a continuing cause for suffering. Eva Kaulariadis has described Bashar al-Assad as the master of ethnic cleansing in the 21st century. During the course of the civil war, Assad ordered depopulation campaigns throughout the country to reshape its demography in favor of his regime, and the military tactics have been compared to the persecutions of the Bosnian War. Between 2011 and 2015, Ba'athist militias are reported to have committed 49 ethno-sectarian massacres for the purpose of implementing its social engineering agenda in the country. Alawite loyalist militias known as the Shabiha have been launched into Sunni villages and towns, perpetrating numerous anti-Sunni massacres. These include the Hawla, Baida, and Bani Yaz massacres, al-Qubayr massacre, al-Hassaiya massacre, etc., which have resulted in hundreds of deaths, with hundreds of thousands of residents fleeing under threats of regime persecution and sexual violence. Pogroms and deportations were pronounced in central Syrian regions and Alawite majority coastal areas, where the Syrian military and Hezbollah view as a priority to establish strategic control by expelling Sunni residents and bringing in Iran-backed Shia militants. In 2016, UN officials criticized Bashar al-Assad for pursuing demographic engineering and ethnic cleansing in Daraya district in Damascus, under the guise of de-escalation deals. Syrian government forces have pursued mass killings of civilian populations as part of its war strategy throughout the conflict, and is responsible for inflicting more than 90% of the total civilian deaths in the Syrian civil war. Between 2011 and 2021, a minimum of 306,000 civilian deaths are estimated to have occurred by the UN. As of 2022, total death toll has risen to approximately 580,000. An additional 154,000 civilians have been forcibly disappeared or subject to arbitrary detentions across Syria, between 2011 and 2023. As of 2023, more than 135,000 individuals are being tortured, incarcerated, or dead in Ba'athist prison networks, including thousands of women and children. Since 2011, the Assad regime has arrested and detained children without trial until the age of 18, after which they were transferred to Syrian military field courts and killed. A 2024 investigative report by the Syrian Investigative Journalism Unit, Siraj, identified 24 Syrian children who were forcibly disappeared, had their assets confiscated, detained, and later killed after they reached the age of 18. The report, based on inside sources within the Assad government, interviews with victims' families, and public sources, estimated that more than 6,000 detainees under the age of 18 were sentenced to death in the Sidnaya prison and an Assadist military field court in Al-Dimas town between 2014 and 2017, citing eyewitness accounts of an insider within the Ba'athist military police. War crimes. The nature and extent of Assad's violence is strategic in design and effect. He is pursuing a strategy of terror, siege, and depopulation in key areas, calculating that winning back the loyalty of much of the Sunni middle class and underclass is highly unlikely and certainly not worth the resources and political capital. Better to level half the country than to give it over to the opposition. Emil Hokaim, Senior Fellow at International Institute for Strategic Studies. Numerous politicians, dissidents, authors, and journalists have nicknamed Assad as the Butcher of Syria for his war crimes, anti-Sunni sectarian mass killings, chemical weapons attacks and ethnic cleansing campaigns. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has stated that at least 10 European citizens were tortured by the Assad government while detained during the Syrian civil war, potentially leaving Assad open to prosecution by individual European countries for war crimes. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Navi Pillay stated in December 2013 that UN investigations directly implicated Bashar al-Assad guilty of crimes against humanity and pursuing an extermination strategy developed at the highest level of government, including the head of state. Stephen Rapp, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues, stated in 2014 that the crimes committed by Assad are the worst seen since those of Nazi Germany. In March 2015, Rapp further stated that the case against Assad is much better than those against Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia or Charles Taylor of Liberia, both of whom were indicted by international tribunals. Charles Lister, director of the Countering Terror and Extremism program at Middle East Institute, describes Bashar al-Assad as 21st century's biggest war criminal. In a February 2015 interview with the BBC, Assad dismissed accusations that the Syrian Arab Air Force used barrel bombs as childish, claiming that his forces have never used these types of barrel bombs and responded with a joke about not using cooking pots either. The BBC Middle East editor conducting the interview, Jeremy Bowen, later described Assad's statement regarding barrel bombs as patently not true. As soon as demonstrations arose in 2011 to 2012, Bashar al-Assad opted to implement the Samson option, the characteristic approach of the neo-Ba'athist regime since the era of Hafez al-Assad, wherein protests were violently suppressed and demonstrators were shot and fired at directly by the armed forces. However, unlike Hafez, Bashar had even less loyalty and was politically fragile, exacerbated by alienation of the majority of the population. As a result, Bashar chose to crack down on dissent far more comprehensively and harshly than his father, and a mere allegation of collaboration was reason enough to get assassinated. Nadim Shihadi, the director of the FAIR's Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies, stated that in the early 1990s, Saddam Hussein was massacring his people and we were worried about the weapons inspectors, and claimed that Assad did that too. He kept us busy with chemical weapons when he massacred his people. Contrasting the policies of Hafez al-Assad and that of his son Bashar, former Syrian vice president and Ba'athist dissident Abdul Halim Khattam states, "The father had a mind and the son has a loss of reason. How could the army use its force and the security apparatus with all its might to destroy Syria because of a protest against the mistakes of one of your security officials? The father would act differently. Father Hafez hit Hama after he encircled it, warned and then hit Hama after a long siege. But his son is different." On the subject of Daraa, Bashar gave instructions to open fire on the demonstrators. Human rights organizations and criminal investigators have documented Assad's war crimes and sent it to the International Criminal Court for indictment. Since Syria is not a party to the Rome Statute, International Criminal Court requires authorization from the UN Security Council to send Bashar al-Assad to tribunal. As this gets consistently vetoed by Assad's primary backer Russia, ICC prosecutions have not transpired. On the other hand, courts in various European countries have begun prosecuting and convicting senior Ba'ath party members, Syrian military commanders and Mukhabarat officials charged with war crimes. In September 2015, France began an inquiry into Assad for crimes against humanity, with French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius stating, "Faced with these crimes that offend the human conscience, this bureaucracy of horror, faced with this denial of the values of humanity, it is our responsibility to act against the impunity of the killers." In February 2016, head of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, Paulo Pinheiro, told reporters, "The mass scale of deaths of detainees suggests that the government of Syria is responsible for acts that amount to extermination as a crime against humanity." The UN Commission reported finding unimaginable abuses, including women and children as young as 7 perishing while being held by Syrian authorities. The report also stated, there are reasonable grounds to believe that high-ranking officers, including the heads of branches and directorates commanding these detention facilities, those in charge of the military police, as well as their civilian superiors, knew of the vast number of deaths occurring in detention facilities, yet did not take action to prevent abuse, investigate allegations, or prosecute those responsible. In March 2016, the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs led by New Jersey Rep. Chris Smith called on the Obama administration to create a war crimes tribunal to investigate and prosecute violations whether committed by the officials of the government of Syria or other parties to the civil war. In June 2018, Germany's chief prosecutor issued an international arrest warrant for one of Assad's most senior military officials, Jamil Hassan. Hassan is the head of Syria's powerful Air Force Intelligence Directorate. Detention centers run by Air Force Intelligence are among the most notorious in Syria, and thousands are believed to have died because of torture or neglect. Charges filed against Hassan claim he had command responsibility over the facilities and therefore knew of the abuse. The move against Hassan marked an important milestone of prosecutors trying to bring senior members of Assad's inner circle to trial for war crimes. In an investigative report about the Tataman massacre, Professors Ugur Umidungur and Ansar Shahoud found witnesses who attested that Assad gave orders for the Syrian military intelligence to direct the Shabiha to kill civilians. 2023 to 2024 arrest warrant and legal proceedings. On November 15, 2023, France issued an arrest warrant against Syrian President Bashar Assad over the use of banned chemical weapons against civilians in Syria. In May 2024, French anti-terrorism prosecutors requested the Paris Appeals Court to consider revoking Assad's arrest warrant, asserting his absolute immunity as a serving head of state. On June 26, 2024, the Paris Appeals Court determined that the international arrest warrant issued by France against Assad for alleged complicity in war crimes during the Syrian civil war remains valid. This decision was confirmed by attorneys involved in the case. According to the lawyers, this ruling marked the first instance where a national court acknowledged that the personal immunity of a serving head of state is not absolute, as reported by the Associated Press. Chemical attacks. The Syrian military has deployed chemical warfare as a systematic military strategy in the Syrian civil war, and is estimated to have committed over 300 chemical attacks, targeting civilian populations throughout the course of the conflict. Investigation conducted by the GPPI Research Institute documented 336 confirmed attacks involving chemical weapons in Syria between December 23, 2012 and January 18, 2019. The study attributed 98% of the total verified chemical attacks to the Assad's regime. Almost 90% of the attacks had occurred after the Ghouta chemical attack in August 2013. Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention and OPCW member state in October 2013, and there are currently 3 OPCW missions with UN mandates to investigate chemical weapons issues in Syria. These are the Declaration Assessment Team, DAT, to verify Syrian declarations of CW Program, OPCW Fact-Finding Mission, FFM, tasked to identify the chemical attacks and type of weapons used, and the Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, which investigates the perpetrators of the chemical attacks. The conclusions are submitted to the United Nations bodies. In April 2021, Syria was suspended from OPCW through the public vote of member states, for not cooperating with the body's Investigation Identification Team, IIT, and violating the Chemical Weapons Convention. Findings of another investigation report published the OPCW-IIT in July 2021 concluded that the Syrian regime had engaged in confirmed chemical attacks at least 17 times, out of the reported 77 chemical weapon attacks attributed to Assadist forces. As of March 2023, independent United Nations inquiry commissions have confirmed at least 9 chemical attacks committed by forces loyal to the Assad government. The deadliest chemical attack have been the Ghouta chemical attacks, when Assad government forces launched the nerve agent sarin into civilian areas during its brutal siege of eastern Ghouta in early hours of August 21, 2013. Thousands of infected and dying victims flooded the nearby hospitals, showing symptoms such as foaming, body convulsions and other neurotoxic symptoms. An estimated 1,100 to 1,500 civilians, including women and children, are estimated to have been killed in the attacks. The attack was internationally condemned and represented the deadliest use of chemical weapons since the Iran-Iraq War. On August 21, 2022, United States government marked the 9th anniversary of Ghouta chemical attacks, stating, "United States remembers and honors the victims and survivors of the Ghouta attack and the many other chemical attacks we assess the Assad regime has launched. We condemn in the strongest possible terms any use of chemical weapons anywhere, by anyone, under any circumstances. The United States calls on the Assad regime to fully declare and destroy its chemical weapons program, and for the regime to allow the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Declaration Assessment Team." In April 2017, there was a sarin chemical attack on Khan Sheikhoun that killed more than 80 people. The attack prompted U.S. President Donald Trump to order the U.S. military to launch 59 missiles at the Syrian Chireh air base. Several months later, a joint report from the UN and international chemical weapons inspectors concluded that the attack was the work of the Assad regime. In April 2018, a chemical attack occurred in Douma, prompting the US and its allies to accuse Assad of violating international laws and initiated joint missile strikes at chemical weapons facilities in Damascus and Homs. Both Syria and Russia denied the involvement of the Syrian government at this time. The third report, published on January 27, 2023 by the OPCWIIT, concluded that the Assad regime was responsible for the 2018 Douma chemical attack, which killed at least 43 civilians. Comments on the Holocaust. In a speech delivered at the Ba'ath Party's Central Committee meeting in December 2023, Bashar al-Assad claimed that there was no evidence of the killings of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. Emphasizing that Jews were not the sole victims of Nazi extermination campaigns, Assad alleged that the Holocaust was politicized by Allied powers to facilitate the mass deportation of European Jews to Palestine, and that it was used as an excuse to justify the creation of Israel. Assad also accused the U.S. government of financially and militarily sponsoring the rise of Nazism during the interwar period. The secular resistance to Assad rule is mainly represented by the Syrian National Council and National Coalition of Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, two political bodies that constitute a coalition of center-left and right-wing conservative factions of the Syrian opposition. Military commanders and civilian leaders of Free Syrian Army militias are represented in these councils. The coalition represents the political wing of the Syrian interim government and seeks the democratic transition of Syria through grassroots activism, protests, and armed resistance to overthrow the Ba'athist dictatorship. A less influential faction within the Syrian opposition is the National Coordination Committee for Democratic Change, NCC, a coalition of left-wing socialist parties that seek to end the rule of Assad family but without foreign involvement. Established in June 2011, major parties in the NCC coalition are the Democratic Arab Socialist Union, Syrian Democratic People's Party and the Communist Labour Party. National Democratic Rally, NDR, was an older left-wing opposition coalition of socialist parties formed in 1980, but banned by the Ba'athist government. NDR was active during the nationwide protests of the 1980s and the Damascus Spring of the 2000s. During the early years of the civil war, the Druze in Syria primarily sought to remain neutral, seeking to stay out of the conflict. Druze Israeli politician Majali Wahabi claimed in 2016 that over half support the Assad government despite its relative weakness in Druze areas. The Sheikhs of Dignity movement, which had sought to remain neutral and to defend Druze areas, blamed the government after its leader Sheikh Wahid al-Balis was assassinated and organized large-scale protests which left 6 government security personnel dead. Druze community became fervently opposed to the Assad government over time and has been vocal about its opposition to increasing Iranian interference in Syria. In August 2023, mass protests against Assad regime erupted in the Druze majority city of Suwaida, which eventually spread to other regions of southern Syria. Druze cleric Hikmet al-Hajari, religious leader of Syrian Druze community, has declared war against Iranian invasion of the country. Syrian Sufi scholar Muhammad al-Yaqubi, a fervent opponent of both the Ba'athist regime and Islamic State group, has described Assad's rule as a reign of terror that wreaked havoc and enormous misery on the Syrian populace. Central to the regime's support base is the Ba'athist loyalists who dominate Syrian politics, trade unions, youth organizations, students' unions, bureaucracy, and armed forces. Ba'ath party institutions and its political activities form the vital pillars of regime survival. Family networks of politicians in the Ba'ath party-led National Progressive Front, NPF, and businessmen loyal to the Assad family form another pole of support. Electoral listing is supervised by Ba'ath party leadership, which expels candidates not deemed sufficiently loyal. Although it has been reported at various stages of the Syrian civil war that religious minorities such as the Alawites and Christians in Syria favor the Assad government because of its secularism, opposition exists among Assyrian Christians who have claimed that the Assad government seeks to use them as puppets and deny their distinct ethnicity, which is non-Arab. Although Syria's Alawite community forms Bashar al-Assad's core support base and dominate the military and security apparatus, in April 2016, BBC News reported that Alawite leaders released a document seeking to distance themselves from Assad. Kurdish Supreme Committee was a coalition of 13 Kurdish political parties opposed to Assad regime. Before its dissolution in 2015, the committee consisted of KNC and PYD. Circassians in Syria have also become strong opponents of the regime as Ba'athist crackdowns and massacres across Syria intensified viciously, and members of Circassian ethnic minority have attempted to escape Syria, fearing persecution. In 2014, the Christian Syriac Military Council, the largest Christian organization in Syria, allied with the Free Syrian Army opposed to Assad, joining other Syrian Christian militias such as the Sudare who had joined the Syrian opposition against the Assad government. Abu Muhammad al-Julani, commander of the Tahrir al-Sham rebel militia, condemned Assad regime for converting Syria into an ongoing earthquake the past 12 years, in the context of the 2023 Turkey-Syria earthquakes. In June 2014, Assad won a disputed presidential election held in government-controlled areas, and boycotted in opposition-held areas and Kurdish areas governed by the Democratic Union Party, with 88.7% of the vote. Turnout was estimated to be 73.42% of eligible voters, including those in rebel-controlled areas. The regime's electoral commission also disqualified millions of Syrian citizens displaced outside the country from voting. Independent observers and academic scholarship unanimously describe the event as a sham election organized to legitimize Assad's rule. In his inauguration ceremony, Bashar denounced the opposition as terrorists and traitors, while attacking the West for backing what he described as the fake Arab Spring. Times of Israel reported that although various individuals interviewed in a Sunni-dominated, middle-class neighborhood of central Damascus exhibited fealty for Assad, it was not possible to discern the actual support for the regime due to the ubiquitous influence of the secret police in the society. Ba'athist dissident Abdul Halim Khaddam, who had served as Syrian vice president during the tenures of both Hafez and Bashar, disparaged Bashar al-Assad as a pawn in Iran's imperial scheme. Contrasting the power dynamics that existed under both the autocrats, Khaddam stated, "Bashar is not like his father. He never allowed the Iranians to intervene in Syrian affairs." During Hafez Assad's time, an Iranian delegation arrived in Syria and attempted to convert some of the Muslim Alawite Syrians to Shia Islam. Assad ordered his Minister of Foreign Affairs to summon the Iranian ambassador to deliver an ultimatum: the delegation has 24 hours to exit Syria. They had no power during Hafez's rule, unlike Bashar, who gave them Iranians power and control. International opposition. Foreign journalists and political observers who traveled to Syria have described it as the most ruthless police state in the Arab world. Assad's violent repression of Damascus spring of the early 2000s and the publication of a UN report that implicated him in the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, exacerbated Syria's post-Cold War isolation. Following global outrage against Assad regime's deadly crackdown on the Arab Spring protesters which led to the Syrian civil war, scorched earth policy against the civilian populations resulting in more than 500,000 deaths, mass murders, and systematic deployment of chemical warfare throughout the conflict, Bashar al-Assad became an international pariah and numerous world leaders have urged him to resign. Since 2011, Bashar al-Assad has lost recognition from several international organizations such as the Arab League, in 2011, Union for the Mediterranean, in 2011, and Organization of Islamic Cooperation, in 2012. United States, European Union, Turkey, Arab League, and various countries began enforcing broad sets of sanctions against Syrian regime from 2011, with the objective of forcing Assad to resign and assist in a political solution to the crisis. International bodies have criticized one-sided elections organized by Assad government during the conflict. In the 2014 London Conference of Countries of the Friends of Syria Group, British Foreign Secretary William Hague characterized Syrian elections as a parody of democracy and denounced the regime's utter disregard for human life for perpetrating war crimes and state terror on the Syrian population. Assad's policy of holding elections under the circumstances of an ongoing civil war were also rebuked by the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. Georgia suspended all relations with Syria following Bashar al-Assad's recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, condemning his government as a Russian-manipulated regime that supported Russian occupation and ethnic cleansing. Following Assad's strong backing of Russian invasion of Ukraine and recognition of the breakaway separatist republics, Ukraine cut off all diplomatic relations with Syria in June 2022. Describing Assad's policies as worthless, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pledged to expand further sanctions against Syria. In March 2023, National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine put into effect a range of sanctions targeting 141 firms and 300 individuals linked to Assad regime, Russian weapons manufacturers and Iranian drone makers. This was days after Assad's visit to Moscow, wherein he justified Russian invasion of Ukraine as a fight against old and new Nazis. Bashar al-Assad, Prime Minister Hussein Arnis and Foreign Minister Faisal Mikdad were amongst the individuals who were sanctioned. Sanctions also involved freezing of all Syrian state properties in Ukraine, curtailment of monetary transactions, termination of economic commitments and rescission of all official Ukrainian awards. Syria formally broke its diplomatic ties to Ukraine on July 20, citing the principle of reciprocity. In April 2023, a French court declared 3 high-ranking Ba'athist security officials guilty of crimes against humanity, torture and various war crimes against French Syrian citizens. These included Ali Mamlouk, Director of National Security Bureau of Syrian Ba'ath Party, and Jamil Hassan, former head of the Syrian Air Force Intelligence Directorate. France had issued international arrest warrants against the 3 officers over the case in 2018. In May 2023, French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna publicly demanded the prosecution of Bashar al-Assad for engaging in chemical warfare and killing hundreds of thousands of people, branding him as the enemy of his own people. On November 15, 2023, France issued an arrest warrant against Assad for use of chemical weapons against civilians in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is widely criticized by left-wing activists and intellectuals worldwide for appropriating leftist ideologies and its socialist, progressive slogans as a cover for his own family rule and to empower a loyalist clique of elites at the expense of ordinary Syrians. His close alliance with clergy-ruled Khomeinist Iran and its sectarian militant networks, while simultaneously pursuing a policy of locking up left-wing critics of Assad family, has been subject to heavy criticism. The Egyptian branch of the Iraqi Ba'ath movement has declared its strong support to the Syrian revolution, denouncing Ba'athist Syria as a repressive dictatorship controlled by the Assad gang. It has attacked Assad family's Ba'athist credentials, accusing the Syrian Ba'ath party of acting as the border guards of Israel ever since its overthrow of the Ba'athist National Command during the 1966 coup d'état. Describing Bashar al-Assad as a disgraceful person for inviting hostile powers like Iran to Syria, Egyptian Ba'athists have urged the Syrian revolutionaries to unite in their efforts to overthrow the Assad regime and resist foreign imperialism. Describing Assad's regime as a mafia state that thrives on corruption and sectarianism, Lebanese socialist academic Gilbert Achkar stated. Bashar Assad's cousin became the richest man in the country, controlling, it is widely believed, over half of the economy. And that's only one member of the ruling clan. The clan functions as a real mafia, and has been ruling the country for several decades. This constitutes the deep root of the explosion, in combination with the fact that the Syrian regime is one of the most despotic in the region. Compared to Assad's Syria, Mubarak's Egypt was a beacon of democracy and political freedom. What is specific to this regime is that Assad's father has reshaped and reconstructed the state apparatus, especially its hard nucleus, the armed forces, in order to create a Praetorian Guard for itself. The army, especially its elite forces, is tied to the regime itself in various ways, most prominently through the use of sectarianism. Even people who had never heard of Syria before know now that the regime is based on one minority in the country, about 10% of the population, the Alawites. The Progressive Socialist Party, PSP, in Lebanon has taken an anti-Assad stance and organized mass protests in support of the Syrian revolution. In August 2012, PSP publicly denounced the Assad government as a killing machine engaged in slaughtering Syrian people. PSP leader Ayman Kamal-Din demanded the expulsion of the Syrian ambassador from Lebanon, describing him as the representative of the murderer regime in Lebanon. Bashar al-Assad's regime has received support from prominent white nationalist, neo-Nazi, and far-right figures in Europe, who were attracted by his war on terror discourse against Islamists during the period of European refugee crisis. Assad's bombings of Syrian cities are admired in the Islamophobic discourse of far-right circles, which considers Muslims as a civilizational enemy. American white supremacists often praise Assad as an authoritarian bulwark against what they view as the forces of Islamic extremism and globalism, and several pro-Assad slogans were chanted in the neo-Nazi Unite the Right rally held in Charlottesville in 2017. Nick Griffin, the former leader of the British National Party, BNP, was formerly an official ambassador and guest of the Syrian government. Due to public controversy, the Assad government publicly disassociated itself from him after his trip to Syria in 2014. Left-wing support for Assad has been split since the start of the Syrian civil war. The Assad government has been accused of cynically manipulating sectarian identity and anti-imperialism to continue its worst activities. Some heads of state or governments have declared their support for Assad, including North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. After declaring victory in the 2014 elections, Assad received congratulations from President of Venezuela Nicolas Maduro, President of Algeria Abdelaziz Bouteflika, President of Guyana Donald Raimoter, President of South Africa Jacob Zuma, President of Nicaragua Daniel Ortega, and Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of Fatah and President of the State of Palestine. Palestinian Marxist, Leninist militant group Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, supported Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war. As a result of this stance, Iranian government increased its military and financial funding to PFLP. International public relations. In order to promote their image and media portrayal overseas, Bashar al-Assad and his wife Asma al-Assad hired US and UK-based PR firms and consultants. In particular, these secured photo shoots for Asma al-Assad with fashion and celebrity magazines, including Vogue's March 2011 A Rose in the Desert. These firms included Bell Pottinger and Brown Lloyd James, with the latter being paid $5,000 a month for their services. At the outset of the Syrian civil war, Syrian government networks were hacked by the group Anonymous, revealing that an ex-Al Jazeera journalist had been hired to advise Assad on how to manipulate the public opinion of the US. Among the advice was the suggestion to compare the popular uprising against the regime to the Occupy Wall Street protests. In a separate email leak several months later by the Supreme Council of the Syrian Revolution, which were published by The Guardian, it was revealed that Assad's consultants had coordinated with an Iranian government media advisor. In March 2015, an expanded version of the aforementioned leaks was handed to the Lebanese Now News website and published the following month. After the Syrian civil war began, the Assad started a social media campaign which included building a presence on Facebook, YouTube, and most notably Instagram. A Twitter account for Assad was reportedly activated, however, it remained unverified. This resulted in much criticism, and was described by the Atlantic Wire as a propaganda campaign that ultimately has made the Assad family look worse. The Assad government has also allegedly arrested activists for creating Facebook groups that the government disapproved of, and has appealed directly to Twitter to remove accounts it disliked. The social media campaign, as well as the previously leaked emails, led to comparisons with Hannah Arendt's A Report on the Banality of Evil by The Guardian, The New York Times and The Financial Times. In October 2014, 27,000 photographs depicting torture committed by the Assad government were put on display at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Lawyers were hired to write a report on the images by the British law firm Carter Ruck, which in turn was funded by the government of Qatar. In November 2014, the Quilliam Foundation reported that a propaganda campaign, which they claimed had the full backing of Assad, spread false reports about the deaths of Western-born jihadists in order to deflect attention from the government's alleged war crimes. Using a picture of a Chechen fighter from the Second Chechen War, pro-Assad media reports disseminated to Western media outlets, leading them to publish a false story regarding the death of a non-existent British jihadist. In 2015, Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war in support of Assad, and on October 21, 2015, Assad flew to Moscow and met with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said regarding the civil war, "This decision can be made only by the Syrian people. Syria is a friendly country. And we are ready to support it not only militarily but politically as well." Thank you for watching this video.